In this lesson, we'll identify some of the key abolitionists, describe the experience of slaves in rural and urban areas, and summarize the slavery debate in the South. How did abolitionists convince people that slavery was wrong? We will explore the answer to that question in this lesson. Abolitionists. Abolitionists were people who felt that slavery should be illegal. And in the 1820s, some people began to openly discuss and question whether slavery was moral or not. Some proposed that Africans should be sent back to Africa. Others thought that the slaves should have violent uprisings to win their freedom. Charles Finney of the Second Great Awakening preached about the evils of slavery, especially in the North. Most whites in the North, though, gave slavery no attention because they were unfamiliar with it and didn't see it every day. Some, especially the Irish, want slavery to continue so that they would not have to compete with the slaves for jobs. Some famous abolitionists are William Lloyd Garrison, who was the writer of the newspaper The Liberator. He wanted slaveholders to release slaves immediately with no payments for their loss, but he also associated with Africans who promoted violent uprisings. He is pictured here. David Walker, pictured here, wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, and he thought that slaves that did not revolt deserved to be enslaved. Frederick Douglass, pictured here, was born a slave and ran away as a child. He was a very eloquent speaker, and he spoke about his life as a slave. He also worked with Garrison for a time, but split with him to write his own newspaper, which he titled The North Star. Slavery. America continued to import slaves until 1808. After that, the natural birth rate is going to cause the slave population to continue to increase. By the mid-1800s, all slaves in America were born there, and they all spoke English. The life expectancy for slaves in America was much longer than Africans who were living in Africa. Men, women, and children worked all day, regardless of their age. Slave marriages were considered illegal, so families could be sold apart. Immigrant labor did not come to the South, so many slaves had the opportunity to learn skills, and some could hire themselves out for pay. Urban slavery had to do with slaves working in larger towns. Sometimes they had the opportunity to work for pay, which was shared with their owner, and there was no overseer in the urban slavery situations. Rural slavery has to do with slaves working in cotton fields and outside all day in the hot sun. They were fed substandard food, lived in wooden shacks, and were beaten for minor infractions. They also had overseers that watched the work they did in the fields to make sure that they were producing. There were a number of slave uprisings periodically, but the slave uprisings were always short-lived. Denmark Vesey led an uprising in 1822 that was very short-lived and relatively unsuccessful because it was short-lived. Nat Turner was a man who is pictured here, who felt that God wanted him to rise up and kill and lead the slaves to kill their masters. He led an uprising leading to the death of 55 whites, and then in retaliation, hundreds of slaves were killed, and the slave codes were strengthened. Slave uprisings never lasted very long, and sometimes the repercussions against your family or against other slaves deterred people from wanting to uprise. Slave codes were laws for slaves that restricted them to make certain that slaves stay under the control of the plantation owners. Uprisings caused codes to become much stricter. For example, one slave code said that no more than 2 slaves could gather or be seen talking together. Another slave code was that it was illegal to teach slaves to read or write, and that was a slave code in most states. Free African Americans could not travel without their papers, and if papers were taken from them or for some reason they lost their papers, they could still be kidnapped and sold back into the South into slavery. Southerners tried to defend slavery and advocate for it They were pro-slavery advocates. Southerners sometimes defended slavery by quoting the Bible, by saying it says in the Bible that slaves should obey their masters. Some said that slaves were learning about Jesus, and so they were becoming not ignorant anymore, and they were away from the savages in Africa. Some argued that slaves were happy doing manual labor. If you can see in the political cartoon below here, that it looks as if the slaves are very content to live in slavery in America. Economics of slavery versus wage earners. Slavery certainly has to do with slaves, people who are not paid for their work. Wage earners has to do with immigrants who were paid for their labor by day or by week. The cost of a field hand was $1,500 to $2,000. The cost to maintain a field hand was about $20 each year. Care was necessary from birth to death, 60 to 70 years, and during non-growing seasons. So it cost a lot of money to purchase a slave up front, but then you had the slave for your whole life, and you had any offspring that they would have. Wage earners, people you would hire to do jobs, were a little different. There was no initial cost for wage earners. Competition between workers kept salaries very low. There were no benefits. You only got paid when there was work to do. And any sick or injured workers did not get paid at all. So which do you think was a better deal? Was it better to purchase a slave and have them for the rest of your life at a fairly low cost? Or was it better to have to pay someone by day or by week or by month to perform whatever job for you? What do you think? In the next lesson, we'll look at women and reform.